So good to be with you guys tonight. I hear you guys have been talking about friendships, and tonight we're talking about when friendships kind of go sideways, when the real stuff happens and a friendship needs to change, or maybe you didn't have a say in it and just a friendship changed in your life. And guys, I have to admit, historically, I've not been very good at this. I really don't know why they asked me to speak on this, because historically, I avoid conflict. Anyone else like to avoid conflict in the room? I'm a people pleaser at heart. I just want everyone to be happy, to like me, to feel good about the situation. And so I typically avoid conflict. Y'all, it was so bad. In high school, I had this on-again, off-again boyfriend. I was that girl that had the on-again and off-again boyfriend that was not very good for me, I might add. And so we were off. We were broken up at that moment in time. A friend in my peer group asked me to go to homecoming. I said yes, because I was single at the time. Well, guess what happened by the time homecoming came around? I got back together with the on and off again boyfriend. And of course, I didn't talk about it or acknowledge it and have a conversation about it. I just kind of pushed through, went to homecoming with the friend, and then got back together with the boyfriend afterwards. It was awkward and weird, and I should have embraced the conflict. So I'm just up here letting you know I don't have this all figured out, but I'm excited to figure it out with you guys. And now we're not talking about dating relationships per se. We're talking more about friendships, but I do think that there's a lot of common similarities. And so why are we talking about this? First of all, it's real life. I'm 30 years old, and when I went back and I looked from 6th grade on, and I counted, there have been 7 different times that my friend circle and group has changed. 7 times. And some of that was I went to college, I changed high schools, I was in one of the rezoning issues. I got moved from McKinney North to McKinney Boyd when it first opened. And so some of that was natural transitions, but there were 7 different times my friend group changed. So it's just real life. And maybe that's just me. Maybe y'all have never had a friend group change, but for me, that was real life. Second reason we're talking about it is you guys have been talking about the importance of guarding your inner circle. Y'all talked about this last week, and those friends that are in your inner circle, they have influence over you. Okay, think about the friends that you're closest to. Think about them right now in your mind. Do you like them? You don't say that out loud, they may be next to you, but do you like them? And then secondarily, do you want to be like them? Not only do you like them, but do you want to be like them? You see, Jim Rohn, who is kind of famous for his research and how people and relationships happen, he says that you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. You're the average of the people that you spend the most time with, those 5 people. That kind of messes with my brain a little bit, because when I think about who I'm around, I better hope that they're who I want to be like. And you guys know this intuitively, because it may be you checked out a new song because of a friend that mentioned it, you checked out a new app because a friend that mentioned it, you maybe tried something that you hadn't tried before because a friend mentioned it, right? We all know that friends influence each other. And so, confessional moment here, I was the person that talked my friends into doing something kind of stupid last Christmas. So last Christmas, you guys know the Christmas jammies, the ones that are kind of tighter than they should be and have that old pattern, old kind of grandma looking pattern on. You know the Christmas jammies I'm talking about? So I convinced not only my husband and 2-year-old child, who didn't have really a say in the matter, I convinced not only them to wear the Christmas jammies with me, I convinced my best couple friends to wear the Christmas jammies with me. And so we were a little extra, and we had matching Christmas jammies, and I brought a picture with me so you guys can see. That's a little ridiculous. Those pants were tighter than they should have been on all of us. But I was that friend that talked my friends into something a little bit out of the box. Because friends influence us, right? And sometimes it's something stupid. You can move that picture past. I can't look at it. Sometimes friends influence us in things like wearing Christmas jammies or maybe going on a roller coaster ride you wouldn't have gone on. And sometimes they influence us in ways that we're not so proud of. Sometimes they influence in ways of going to that party that you know you shouldn't have gone to, or smoking pot in the parking lot when you know that you shouldn't have, right? Whatever that is, friends influence us in the small ways and in the big ways. And so guarding your inner circle, it matters. It's what you guys talked about last week. Proverbs 13 says that when you walk with the wise, you become wise. When you associate with fools, you get in trouble. And I love the word walk with, right? Because that's really what you do with your friends. You walk with them. You make a Target run with them. You study after school with them. You go to a party with them. Like, you walk with your friends. You journey in life with them. And so I love that phraseology. And here's the thing. Friends who are really good friends for us, they want what's best for us, right? They're rooting us on in our soccer game or our swim meet or our football game because they want what's best for us. If they're Jesus followers, they're rooting us on as we try to live a life that we're proud of. And Jesus calls us to live this full and abundant life. And friends that are good for us help us live that. But sometimes what happens when our inner circle isn't wanting what's best for us? And then some distance kind of comes. Or what happens when life just happens and distance comes? I don't know what happens for you, but for me, I don't super recognize it right away. I just start to notice some tension in a relationship, or I start to notice some distance in a relationship. I've been learning I'm not as self-aware as I thought I was, and so it takes me a little while to notice it. But it's that moment when your mom asks you, hey, I haven't seen so-and-so around in a while, where are they? And you're like, oh, like maybe there's an easy answer, or maybe there's not an easy answer, and you just really haven't like paid attention to it yet. And so I want to encourage you guys, when that kind of happens in a friendship, to pay attention to the tension inside of you. Pay attention to the internal conflict that's happening when you recognize yourself distancing yourself from someone. And it could be for a small reason or it could be for a big reason. Y'all, sometimes like your physical location just changes. You move schools. You're not around those people anymore, and so you just don't see them all the time. Or maybe it's you changed interests. I remember whenever I went into 7th grade, I just completely changed like the classes I was in, like everything from 6th to 7th grade, and so my friend group just changed. It didn't feel great at the time because I had to make a whole new group of friends, but it wasn't negative. It was just my interests changed. So sometimes it can be your physical location, sometimes it can be your interests, other times it can be your values. Maybe your values changed, or maybe your friends' values changed, not for the positive. I know that's happened to me on both sides of that. And so sometimes distance is a big deal, sometimes it's kind of neutral and it's not. Either way, I want you to pay attention to the tension in your friendships, and I want you to lean into those moments because how you handle them, it matters. How you handle distance in friendships, it matters because you can be friends with someone, you can be friendly with someone even though you're not friends. Oftentimes I think we avoid feeling that tension. Like I said earlier, I wanted to avoid conflict. And so when you're experiencing that tension, I kind of want you to ask 2 questions. Like, what kind of tension am I experiencing? Where did it come from? Did it come from value change, interest change, or just by physical location, proximity, did that change? And then secondly, I want you to think about what kind of friendship is it? Is it a walking with the wise situation where you want to be friends with that person? Because sometimes tension happens in those relationships too, right? Like they're good people, they want what's best for you, and sometimes tension just happens there. Or is it the kind of relationship where you're like, they really don't make me better. I'm not so sure that's the best thing for me right now. So try to figure out what kind of tension it is, and then what kind of relationship is it. And then I think you can take the appropriate next steps. And sometimes if it's a healthy relationship, a walking with the wise scenario, you need to close the distance in that friendship. I had a friend a couple years ago. I have got a little 2-year-old now, but I guess this was 4 or 5 years ago. My husband and I we were really praying about starting a family, really praying about being able to have a baby, and we weren't able to. And it took us a long time. And that was hard. Like I would see people get pregnant and people have baby showers, and it was hard for me. And my best friend was one of those that she got pregnant really easily. And so that was hard. Like, and I found myself putting distance between us because our situations were different. And she's the one, not me, because I avoid conflict, that took me out to coffee and was like, Allison, we need to talk about this. Like, I love you. I want to like push through this and figure this out together. And so that was a relationship. She was a good friend. She was making me better, but there was tension and we needed to address it. And I'm so glad that she's the one that called me out to coffee. And maybe that's true for some of you guys. Like, you've got a good friend that is a good influence on you. They want what's best for you. And there's just tension. Pay attention to it. And if it's someone you really want in your life, you can initiate that conversation, get it more like my friend did than like me waiting on her to initiate it. And it can be a blessing to you. Secondly, sometimes you just need to embrace the distance in friendships. You need to embrace the distance because it's neutral. Maybe your interests changed, your physical location changed, or maybe you need to embrace the distance because it's an unhealthy relationship. Whenever I was in 8th grade, I started following Jesus more actively. And I started trying to figure out what that meant for the first time. And I had these friends that have been my friends for the last couple of years, and I was really close with them. And then I kind of had these church friends. And when I would go to church, I was kind of one person, and then I was with my old friends, I was another person. And I kind of felt like I was in between friend groups, and I had these two friend circles. And then as I realized I was with my church friends who were following Jesus, and they were encouraging me to do things like serve in the kids ministry. I was dancing on stage with kids ministry when I was a teenager. Or they were encouraging me to go on a mission trip or, come hang out. We played water polo. I really don't know why. All the guys in my friend circle loved to play water polo, a bunch of swimmers, and the girls just sat and talked. But we played water polo. It was like good, clean fun. And so, like when I was with my church friends, that's what we would do. And then when I was with my old friends, gosh, I loved them, but they were the ones that were trying to get me to go further with my boyfriend than I wanted to go. That on again, off again boyfriend. Not a good guy. I'm sure he's great now. But they were the ones that were trying to get me to stuff like that. They were the ones that were trying to get me like on an online chat room, like talking to guys that were older than us. Like I specifically remember some of these moments where I didn't pay attention to the tension that was happening inside of me. And I really had to embrace the distance in that friendship. And so maybe some of you guys, there's some embracing the distance and just embracing it and letting that happen. And that's hard, y'all. It's hard when you're the one that initiates that. It's also hard when you're the one that's left on the other side. Whenever I was talking to a friend back there, I was talking about a friend that I would love to be closer to, but she's the one that's embraced a little distance in our relationship. And so it doesn't really go away no matter what life stage you're in. There's always going to be distance in friendships. But here's the thing, and here's what I believe. I believe if we pay attention to that tension and we're self-reflective and we seek God in it, I believe that we can be friendly even though we aren't friends. And what's crazy enough is the Bible addresses this in Acts. And so I want to spend some time with you guys in Acts 15 tonight. Acts is written by Luke, who wrote the book Luke, and then he also wrote the book of Acts. And so this is kind of like what was happening after Jesus died on the cross and rose again. Like this is kind of right after that situation, kind of the local church. And so this is Acts 15, 36 through 41. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, I'm going to actually pause. Paul, just so you guys catch up here, Paul was he was a Jesus hater. Like he persecuted Jesus, like Jesus followers, he persecuted Christians, he put Christians in jail. Like he was very anti-Christians. And then he had this radical conversion moment where he experienced Jesus, and all of a sudden, he's like one of the most influential writers in the Bible, and he's one of the most influential pastors in that time, which is super cool. God can redeem anything, but that's who Paul is. And whenever Paul had this radical conversion, the first person to welcome Paul into his home was named Barnabas. I like Barnabas for that reason. He's like a second chance kind of guy. And I'm not sure that I would have had the guts to do that. If someone hated me and my people, and then all of a sudden had this miraculous conversion, I'm not so sure I would believe them that they had converted. I'd wait and see, But Barnabas was the kind of guy who was like, no, come into my home right away, which is pretty cool. And the third person we're going to see is Mark. John Mark, sometimes some of the verses say. But Mark, he is cousins of Barnabas. So that's who we're reading about. We'll go back to 36. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, let us go back and visit the believers in all of the towns where he preached the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. So Paul and Barnabas had just finished this journey, and they went from city to city, telling each city about Jesus and sharing the good news. And so at this point, it's been a while since they've been in those local cities. And so they wanted to go back and check on them. How are you doing? How can we help you? That's what they're wanting to do. Verse 37 says, Barnabas wanted to take Mark, John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it was wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. So Mark had actually been on one of those missionary journeys, and he kind of backed out. And Paul's like, hey, I'm not so sure we want to trust this Mark guy again. And Barnabas, second chance Barnabas, is really wanting to bring Mark along. Verse 39 says they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. This is a distance in a friendship right here. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went to Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. And so what I love, though, is even though there was this sharp disagreement, and Scripture doesn't say why, it doesn't say if it was kind of neutral or what it was, but it was sharp disagreement. What I love is, but then Barnabas took Mark and went this way, and Paul took Silas and went this way. So what naturally humans, and our conflict and distance in relationships kind of wanted to divide, I think the Spirit multiplied. Like, God is able to work in and through any sort of friendship, distance, and division that is happening. And I think that the world wants to divide that. They want to play the good cop, bad cop game, that someone's good and someone's bad, or someone was the good influence and someone was the bad influence. It's not always black and white like that. And I think when we let God in, we can move from what the flesh divides to the Spirit can multiply. Because in that case, twice as many people got to hear about Jesus. Like, so even though it was this negative friendship departure, God used it, and twice as many people got to hear about Jesus. They could have let this change in their friendship stop them. They could have let this impact the work they felt called to do, or they could have stopped talking about Jesus altogether and started talking about each other, because that can happen as well. But they didn't. Their friendship changed and ended, but it didn't affect the mission they shared. I think it's a great example for all of us. And so there's 4 truths that I want to look at in our remaining time together that I think come from this passage. The first is that distance doesn't always mean the friendship wasn't meaningful. Like what Paul and Barnabas did together in that first missionary journey, it was so impactful. They got to take the good news of Jesus to cities that had never heard it before. Like, you can't say that wasn't impactful. It was so meaningful. What they got to do was meaningful. But it's really easy for us to say when there's distance in a friendship, oh, we weren't that close anyways. Oh, I knew that friendship wouldn't last. It's like a defense mechanism, I think, at least for me, where I just want to like naturally put some divide in it. But I think when we just acknowledge, hey, that friendship was meaningful, it's just not going to happen in this next season. And just because a friendship doesn't have a future, it doesn't impact what happened in the past. And I think Paul and Barnabas did a really great job of that because they had a great past. And their futures just looked differently, and God used it, and they were able to reach twice as many people. Distance also, it doesn't mean that you have to be enemies. Like, you can have a friendship-ending disagreement that doesn't have to affect the other person for the worse. I think we naturally, want to oversimplify it. I mentioned this a minute ago. We want to make someone good and someone bad, someone the good influence, someone the bad influence, someone the, conflict starter, and the other person the peacekeeper, right? We want to just naturally divide it because it's easier that way, I think. But really, I think believing that you can be friendly without being friends is important. And Scripture says that we need to make sure our gentleness is evident to all, that we handle every situation with kindness and compassion. And Paul and Barnabas did a great job of this. Remember, they had a sharp disagreement. That's what the Scripture says. I really want to know what that means. But it says they had a sharp disagreement. And then in 1 Corinthians, Paul is actually referencing Barnabas as like an example. So like behind his back, Paul is talking about Barnabas as like, he's someone you should be like. Well, that doesn't sound like how I typically handle conflict and friendship. I love that example, that he was able to move on and be so positive towards Barnabas. And then even later, Paul actually asks Mark, like the guy who abandoned the ship in the first missionary journey that the whole conflict happened over, he actually asked Mark to come help him later. And so again, being friendly, even though they're not friends, made all the difference. And I think it's important to be mindful of 2 things in this case. Be careful what you think about the other person, because what you think affects what you say and how you act. And be careful with what you say. Believe the best. Maybe they aren't out to get you. Maybe there's something going on they didn't just share. I think the world loves a good drama story, loves a good gossip story, and so people will be watching. And as people who are following Jesus, we want to show that you can be friendly even without being friends. I think choosing to be a bridge builder and not a bridge burner is so important, because if Paul had burned that bridge with Mark, he would have never been able to ask him to come help later in Paul's time. The third thing I think we can learn from this passage is that distance doesn't mean something is wrong. Like, yeah, there was a sharp disagreement, but these were 2 good dudes. Like, they loved the Lord. They were sharing Jesus with cities who didn't know Jesus. And they just had different philosophies. Barnabas' philosophy was a second chance guy. He just wanted to give Mark a second chance. And for Paul, he just knew how important it was to get to spread the word of Jesus well the first time. This would be the first time those cities heard that good news. And he wanted to make sure it was done right. Like, that's just 2 different philosophies. Neither is wrong or right. The 4th thing we can learn is that distance doesn't mean your story ends. I'm kind of the person that when I'm processing, I kind of process all the worst case scenario options, and then I kind of come back and even out. It can drive my husband crazy because he's like, that's not going to happen. But I have to process all those things and just make sure I'm okay with it. But distance, like, it doesn't mean your story ends. And the fact that their friendship changed, but their mission didn't, I think it's beautiful. Like, I want to be more like that, because not only did they like double the amount of people that got to hear the good news, and that's how God used that and redeemed that, but also, like, literally a couple verses later, Paul gets to meet Timothy. And Timothy ended up writing a couple books in the Bible. Timothy ended up being someone he mentored. Like, that wouldn't have happened if Paul had still had all of his relationship capacity met with Barnabas. And then, this is even crazier, Mark, he went on to write the book of Mark. Like, he went on to write like one of the Gospels. And a couple of the other Gospels were actually based on Mark. And so that would have never happened, right? So when you look and see what good came of that end, I think that's important. And when I look back to that big friendship divide I had in 8th and 9th grade-ish, like, saying no to those friends that were there for me in 7th and 8th grade, it was super hard. Like I missed them. Like, I grieved moving on from that season of my life. But then when I stepped into that friend group that I had in high school, it was actually one of the sweetest friendship circles that I've had in my 30 years of life. And it was really a sweet blessing. And so it just really brings me to this final truth that the end is not just an end, it's also a beginning. Like, when you say no to something, you're not just saying no to that, you're saying yes to your future. You're saying yes to what God could have for you. And as we kind of wrap up this series, I want to encourage all of you to think about the friendships in your life. Think about just anything in your life. It doesn't have to be even friendships, but sometimes there's endings that can lead to new beginnings. Sometimes a friendship ending might be in order for you to step into the full and abundant life God has for you. And you see, this is just how his math works, because Jesus had to die, literally, on the cross, in order to be raised again. Like, sometimes there has to be death in something so there can be rebirth in something else. And so believing this, I think, is so important. And so my question for you guys tonight, as I just kind of wrap up, is what ending do you need to embrace to join God's new beginning work inside of you? It may not have anything to do with friendships. Like, I recognize that. It could be saying, no to something good so you can say yes to something great. It could be saying no to something that's taking all your time so you can say yes to something that will help you be who God has for you in the future. And if it is a friendship, remember, it doesn't mean what you had before wasn't meaningful. It doesn't mean you have to be enemies. It doesn't mean something's wrong. And it definitely doesn't mean your story is ending. And I believe sometimes saying no so that God can say yes to what's next is so important, because I think you're worth it. Like, you are worth it. Scripture in Ephesians, it says you are God's masterpiece, created in advance for good works. And the one time this verse came alive to me in a way that it never had before, I was sitting having breakfast. I was a senior in college. It was a girl that was in my small group. She was a sophomore or a junior, and she had just given her life to Jesus like a year ago or something real soon. And her life was radically changing. Like, she was going from this super insecure, she's a sweet little redhead, to she was learning to be confident in who Jesus made her to be. Like, her life was changing. But she had this boyfriend that was kind of holding her back. Like, it wasn't a great choice for her. And I remember I was just praying in that moment, like, how can I help her see that she needs to say no to that so she can say yes to what God has in her future? And this kind of verse spit out of my mouth, one of those moments where the Holy Spirit just takes over. And I was like, you are God's masterpiece. Like, you are an art, like, creation. And I feel like God's doing this beautiful new work in you. And yet you keep leaving that piece of artwork out in the rain. And the rain's just washing away all that paint, that beautiful masterpiece and artwork that God is doing inside of you. And if you would just protect it, and then you would get to see the beautiful thing that God's doing inside of you. And I think the same is true for you. You are a masterpiece. You were created by the creator of the universe on purpose and for a purpose. And you have to be careful the atmosphere and the environment that you put yourself in, because just like a piece of artwork, if it's in the sun too much, it'll fade. Or if it's in too like humid of an environment, the paint will peel. You have to be careful the atmosphere that you're in, because you were created on purpose and for a purpose. So what distance do you need to embrace in a friendship? What tension do you need to pay attention to? Or what ending do you need to embrace in order to join God's beginning work inside of you? I'm going to end with this final verse, Isaiah 43. But forget all that. Whatever your past is, forget all that. It is nothing compared to what I'm about to do. I don't know who needs to hear that tonight, but forget all that. Forget yesterday. Forget a year ago. Forget what happened 5 years ago. It is nothing compared to what I'm about to do. For I'm about to do something new. See, I've already begun. Do you not see it? I will make a pathway through the wilderness. I will create rivers in the dry wasteland. God is doing something new in each and every one of you. And I pray that you'll have the courage to say no to whatever is good so you can say yes to whatever is great in your life.